Now we go. Okay, thank you very much. I have to say the last time I was here at about this moment, all the power went off in Santa Fe. Anybody was here for that talk? There you go. So we had a lot of fun, we sang, we did everything, but actually look at the slides. So I'm thinking this won't happen this time because that's good. Because my wife and I were in Phoenix over the weekend, and we were staying in that hotel that caught fire on Saturday and had to be evacuated. So I'm hoping that my act of God card has been punched for this trip in the Southwest, and that the lights will stay on and everything will work out. So we're looking here at a brand new old picture of Fred Harvey. So this is the first new picture of Fred Harvey that we have found forever. And it's going to be in the upcoming show, which I hope you will all be here for the opening on December 7th. Certainly everybody in the Fredisphere is going to be coming in from all over the country. Lots of Harveys, lots of what we call Fred heads. And I hope you'll be there. And so I want to talk to you today not only about the work that we did on Fred Harvey, but sort of what's happened since the book came out, since the museum really embraced Fred Harvey, which is really leading up to all the things that are going to be happening over the next couple of weeks. So I was introduced to Fred Harvey the way everybody has been up to this point, but I have to say I believe there will be a point in the future where people will be introduced to Fred Harvey here in Santa Fe and here in New Mexico more. But for the last 40 years, I would say most people learn about Fred Harvey at the Grand Canyon. Now, everybody here has been at the Grand Canyon, right? I guess I should ask you, raise your hand if you haven't. So you should start making your reservations right now. So when you go to the Grand Canyon, you stay at El Tovar, and in the main hallway there where the steps are, you see this portrait of this guy. In 1993, my wife and I came to El Tovar. We saw this portrait and it said Fred Harvey, and we had no idea who Fred Harvey was. We went to our room, and there were some pamphlets there about Fred Harvey, and we still had no idea who Fred Harvey was because we grew up in the East. And in the East, no one's ever heard of Fred Harvey. They've only ever heard of Howard Johnson, who sort of came after Fred Harvey's company ceased being as powerful as it had been. So we had no idea what any of this was. We took in the Grand Canyon in all its majesty in about 8 hours, so we really paid careful attention. Really good American tourist at its best. And several of them were sleeping at El Tovar, so we really didn't see very much. I did see the sunrise. And then we went to Petrified Forest, which on a map looked like it was pretty close to Grand Canyon. And so we got at Petrified Forest at 4:45, and it closed at 5 o'clock. So we went 60 miles an hour through Petrified Forest, again, appreciating all the splendor of nature, blah, blah, blah. And ended up at the end at a gift shop that had a huge sign that said, Fred Harvey. And my wife turned to me and said, "Who the hell is Fred Harvey?" And we went into the shop, and I bought a book and a little pamphlet about Fred Harvey and sort of put it away. This is actually my wife during our trip to El Tovar in 1993. She's spinning 6 guns that we bought at the Fred Harvey gift shop at El Tovar. The set came with holsters and a badge, pretty nice. And we recently went back to Petrified Forest, and these are the last Fred Harvey signs in America, the original Fred Harvey signs. This is on the side of the building. That's me acting like an idiot. And that's my wife pointing to the sign that we saw then. So, without boring with the whole story, 18 years later I wrote a book about Fred Harvey. And you can read the book and we can talk about that. But we're not here to talk about my book and my journey. But I will say that in the last few months I had a great opportunity. The New Mexico Magazine asked me to do a piece, which is coming out in a few weeks, which is leading up to all these events that we're having in New Mexico about Fred Harvey, the opening of the show, and also commemorating the fact that some amazing things have happened. I mean, the Castaneda got bought, which is in and of itself kind of a miracle, and La Fonda was purchased by Jenny Kimball, so somebody who really has a great understanding of the Fred Harvey traditions, and I think will make it even more. So this is, you're not supposed to see this yet, but this is the opening spread of the story. It's really beautiful, and the rest of the piece you'll be able to see in a couple of weeks. And another thing that we had made during all this, and I'll embarrass Meredith and show this, this is our Fred head logo. And actually one of Fred's great-great-grandchildren made with us as something for the opening of the museum center. So Fred head is a term that actually came up when the word deadhead came up. People at the Grand Canyon who worked at the Grand Canyon started calling themselves Fred heads. So this wasn't known; it was only Fred Harvey employees. But now people who love Fred Harvey call themselves Fred heads. So one day on the phone, Meredith and I were saying, like, wouldn't it be cool if we just took the logo and did that with it? So that's what we did. For those of you who have no idea who Fred Harvey is, let me give you sort of like the basic story. So this is Fred Harvey. He came to America from England in 1853. We'll walk you through some of the history up to the point where he actually matters in the restaurant business. But in his early 40s, he decided to go back in the restaurant business, and he opened this restaurant on the second floor of this building where it says dining room up there in the Topeka, Kansas, Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe train station. Now, at this time, the railroads each had their own train stations, their own routes, and basically west of Chicago, there were no dining cars. So food service was done at eating houses on the side of the tracks, and all the food was unbelievably bad because all the restaurants were run by local people who knew they were never going to see you again. So they would serve really bad food about 5 minutes before the train would come. You would eat a bite, the whistle would blow, and you would go back, and then they would actually scrape the food off the plate and serve it to the next people coming in because no one was ever going to know. Fred Harvey, who'd been working in the railroad business his whole life, believed that if somebody actually did something about this and made the food and the service in the Western railroads better, that when people were choosing railroads, keep in mind, if you were going to go to California, there were like 5 different railroads you could take to get there. So it would be as if airlines each had their own airports and you had to choose between them. There were no Union stations at this time. So this really was about the competition between the companies. So from 1876, when they started with this little lunchroom, by the turn of the century, this is how big the Fred Harvey Company was. Now, keep in mind, we know lots of companies that are this big now. This is not so surprising. The Fred Harvey Company was the first national chain of anything in the world. Okay? First restaurants, then hotels, retail stores. They were in 80 different cities, and basically they started out with the railroads in the 1870s, 1880s had small wooden depots, and they would have a small lunchroom, sort of like the beginnings of a diner. They would have a sit-down, white tablecloth restaurant with actually really fine food and food brought in from all over the country on the trains. And they also had takeout coffee, so it was sort of like a good restaurant with your favorite diner attached to Starbucks 150 years ago. And this was a revelation in places where there was no good coffee, where you could never eat meat that was rare because you would die. So this was all over the place. And these were originally set up really for train travelers. The fact that local people liked them and got to eat in them was secondary. They were really for the people on the trains. And in fact, if you were a local person and you were eating in a Fred Harvey eating house, when the train came in, they stopped serving you. Because the people came off the train and they had to be fed and they had to be taken care of. And as soon as they were gone, then they would bring the rest of your food. That's the relationship that people had with the Fred Harvey restaurants, really for like 70 years. And they were just accustomed to it, and they realized that that was why they got these, sort of city-quality restaurants often in the middle of nowhere. At the turn of the century, after the Great Depression of the 1890s, the Santa Fe Railroad, which had gone bankrupt, and Fred Harvey, which almost went bankrupt, sort of doubled down on their mission, and especially in the Southwest. And they started building mission-style resort hotels, because the Southwest before this time was sort of like the flyover states on the way to California. No one would actually stop in the stinking desert to actually do something. But the railroad felt that maybe they could make that into a business. They built the Castaneda Hotel. It opened in 1898. And it was inaugurated in the national press because they convinced Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders to have their reunion at the Castaneda. So the entire national press would have to come there. And it was like one of the first great underwriting deals for a national thing. Not long after, they built the Alvarado Hotel in Albuquerque, and they began a string of these mission-style hotels all the way to California. They also got into the Union Station business. By this time, cities were starting to build Union Stations, so Fred Harvey took over all the retail and the food at St. Louis Union Station, and then a number of other Union Stations. In 1905, they opened at the Grand Canyon. And the Grand Canyon was a whole other business. It actually became the biggest business within Fred Harvey. Everything else was much smaller. They developed into more Union stations. This is Kansas City Union Station, which they ran completely, and the corporate headquarters was in starting in 1914. Chicago Union Station, which actually used to have big Fred Harvey letters on the side of it. And then in the 1920s, the company really got involved in tourism. Now, it doesn't mean they didn't have tourism before. They were taking care of plenty of people, but they were outsourcing everything. In the 20s, they started really doubling down on tourism, especially in Santa Fe and in northern New Mexico. So they bought La Fonda, doubled its size, and created something called, come on, where's this one? There it is. The Indian Detour. And the Indian Detour was a trip to all the places that you all take for granted that people are going to go to, Native American pueblos, all this kind of stuff, but they were advertising it internationally, and people poured in from around the world to have these experiences. This is the time period when La Posada was built in Winslow. It was part of the Indian Detour program. And this is what the Harvey Company looked like at its peak in 1929. It had depot operations in more than 80 cities, including most of the major stops along Route 66. There were 7,000 employees. They had their own dairy farms, their own bottling plant in Emporia, which was the only place that could privately bottle Coca-Cola. They had huge tourism operations at the Grand Canyon and in Santa Fe. They'd taken over the Union stations, and they got involved in the airline business as well. The last of the major stations that they were involved with doing was Los Angeles Union Station in the late 1930s. The company compressed because of a number of reasons which we'll talk about in a bit. The Depression not the only one, and the cutback of the railroads not the only one. And then had a glorious comeback during the Second World War because the federal government asked all the closed Harvey restaurants to reopen to serve the troops. So for a number of years they had this enormous flow of people. They would take over the restaurants and turn them into big feeding stations. They would feed soldiers sitting in the trains. And the company had this huge comeback, which is part of the reason that in 1946, Judy Garland, who was the biggest movie star in the country, would play a Harvey girl in a big MGM musical, which was a huge movie that year. The company thought this would be the turning point and they would get even bigger. In fact, they kind of didn't. And this is what the company looked like after the Second World War. It was still a significant company. In the Southwest, still owned many properties, and of course controlled the Grand Canyon, which was the cornerstone of tourism here. But it was a smaller company and continued into the 1960s, 1970s before most of its properties were sold. From a New Mexico point of view, keep in mind that while the Fred Harvey Company extended all the way from Chicago to California and all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, New Mexico was really, in many ways, the place where many of the major turning points for the company were. So the company had a handful of locations before it came into New Mexico. It quickly had to have a lot of locations, and the Wild West in New Mexico was much wilder than what they were used to in Kansas. So a lot of the systems that were put into place by the Harvey were put in place to deal with New Mexico, because up to that point they hadn't had to have that. The Harvey girls were invented in New Mexico at Raton. And they were part of this systematizing of the company. In 1898, as I said, the Castaneda was the beginning of these new mission-style hotels that the company built all over the Southwest. They began a Native American art and craft business at the turn of the century, which revolutionized Native American art. And the international advertising of the Southwest during the 1920s was really one of the major turning points in bringing people to the Southwest. So, let me introduce you to Fred, and now some of these things we found for the first time when we were working on the book, and luckily when the book was done, I had all the stuff that I borrowed from the family, and I said, could I convince you just to donate this stuff to the New Mexico History Museum rather than taking it all back, because a museum should have it and take care of it, and they all said yes. So a lot of these things I had in my house for 6 years, and now they're here. So it was our goal that when the book was done, that one place would be the new modern place to really take over the Harvey legacy. We hoped it would be Santa Fe, and 4 years later, obviously I'm here, so it worked out okay. You'll see some of these things in the upcoming show, but what's also really nice is that you can access them at the Chavez Library. I mean, they're there, and you can look at them if you're interested in doing this history. So this is the earliest picture we have of Fred Harvey, who, as I said, came to America in 1853. This is the restaurant he worked in New York City when he first got off the boat, Smith and McNell. He worked there for over a year as what is called a pot walloper, a busboy, learned the business. and then decided to go into business himself. He left New York and went to St. Louis. This is the first picture we have of him in St. Louis. I will warn you, Fred Harvey had a series of bad hair days in his life. And as someone who has a lot of pictures in my own school yearbook of bad beards, I will say that Fred Harvey went through a lot of beards. So this is one of the more calm ones. Anyway, this is Fred when he was in St. Louis, as is this. So Fred Harvey came to St. Louis. He opened a restaurant right near the pier, right near the wharfs on the Mississippi River. He had a partner. They were doing well. He went back to England, found a wife, brought her back. They had a child, and they were about to have another child when the Civil War broke out. Fred's partner in the restaurant was a Southern sympathizer. One day he left with all their money, and Fred was broke. Not long after, Fred's wife gave birth to their second child and died in childbirth. So by the his late 20s, Fred had come to America, sort of had an American dream experience that had lost everything. He then went to be employed in transportation in Missouri. Since Missouri was the end of where the trains were, in transportation you sort of learned trains, you learned boats, and then you learned covered wagons, because that's what went in through Kansas. So Fred worked on packet boats. He worked in various transportation things. He also got typhoid fever, so you can see he looks really bad here. And he had health problems his whole life, which we think are probably one of the reasons that he wanted to make hotels that people got better taken care of, because he was tired of feeling so crummy at his hotels. He lived in St. Joseph, Missouri for a period. He remarried, and then he and his wife, Sally Mattis from St. Louis, moved to Leavenworth, Kansas. So this is downtown Leavenworth. This was actually the most bustling city in the West at this time, and was expected to be the next great city after St. Louis, was bidding for the Transcontinental Railroad contract, didn't get it. But Fred moved there predicting that that would be the best place for him to be in business. And not long after he and his wife and their two children arrived there, both of the children died of scarlet fever. So we see in the newspaper actually the announcement that Fred Harvey's coming to town and the announcement of the death of his children. And then he and his wife rebuilt a life there. They had 5 kids, and even though Leavenworth did not turn out to be the great place that they thought it would be for business, Fred was a railroad man. He moved around on the railroads and he could live wherever he wanted, so his family stayed in Leavenworth. We actually have a lot of his things from Leavenworth. This is one of his first wallets. This is his photo on his photo business cards. If you think photo business cards are new, Fred had one in 1865. We actually have, this is another one of his early pictures. We have a lot of his date books from this time. This is the earliest one from 1867. A lot of the letters that he wrote home. And basically for over a decade, Fred's job was away from restaurants. He was what's called a freight agent. So when the railroads built new tracks to a place, the freight agent came to talk to the people who were working there about bringing whatever they were mining back to the east, bringing cattle back, bringing vegetables back. So Fred Harvey had to learn everybody's business to be a smart freight agent. And he represented a number of Midwestern railroads, and he basically, wherever the railroads attached to the rest of the world, Fred Harvey showed up. It was actually easy to research this part of the book, because when Fred came to town, it was a big deal. It was in the newspaper that Fred Harvey from the railroad was there, and businessmen should take note. So you could really follow him around. But what Fred always wanted to do was to get back into the business that he had started. So what we know is that in 1875, he cut this out of the newspaper and stuck it into his date book. This date book will be in the show. And this is, I made a PowerPoint of this. It's a list of maxims for businessmen. And the last few, I always like, law is a trade in which lawyers eat the oysters and leave the clients the shells. Give a foolish talker rope enough and he will hang himself. And then the last 3 are really the ones that Fred Harvey lived his life by. Never have anything to do with an unlucky man. Be cautious and bold and make a bargain at once. And what Fred decided to do was to go back into the restaurant business along the railroads. He first started with a partner from Leavenworth, and they ran a couple of restaurants on the Kansas Pacific. They quickly, boldly realized they hated working together, and so Fred got out of that business and instead made a deal with the Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe Railroad, which at that time basically attached Atchison and Topeka. I mean, it was a very small railroad with great hopes, and they made a deal with Fred that if he took over this lunchroom in Topeka, he could, he would have to buy all his own furniture, but he could keep all the profits from the food, and they would bring all the food in for free, and any of his employees would come for free. And so he immediately took over this very dingy lunchroom and ordered china and ordered, beautiful, beautiful silverware and crystal from Europe and made it into like a dining room you would see like in a big city, and people really liked this. And then he moved on to Florence, Kansas, which actually was the major feeding place for the railroad. Now, these guys here are not the kind of guys you think you want to build an entire boutique restaurant at the rail. But in fact, this is who lived in Florence, except when the train came in. So when the train came in, the population tripled, and people ate at that building back there, which Fred decided that he would turn into a world-class restaurant. He hired the chef and general manager from the Palmer House in Chicago to come there. And we know how successful they were very quickly. This guy, William Phillips, was also British, because the British press took a great fascination with the fact that these two British guys had opened this hotel and restaurant in the middle of nowhere in Florence, Kansas. And so we have these glowing articles about the place from the game correspondent from the London newspaper, who couldn't believe that you could come to a beautiful place in the middle of nowhere. You could also fish and hunt, and they would prepare everything that you made. So the British were quite fascinated with the bounty of America. And so this place, which was called the Clifton Hotel, became really well known. And the model of having a very upscale restaurant in the middle of nowhere really appealed to the railroad, really appealed to Fred, and that was their operative idea. This is actually the only picture of the Clifton Hotel when it was done. Fred started making money. He invested in a number of things, including cattle. He bought a ranch in western Kansas, which for literary fans, I always thought was cool that the ranch is, part of the ranch is Holcomb, Kansas. Does that name mean anybody? Anybody? In Cold Blood. So the In Cold Blood murder. So Fred Harvey owned the farm where the In Cold Blood murders took place. I have to say, I thought that was really cool. Anyway, but he was really smart. He bought this ranch with his bosses at the Santa Fe so that they would make money in the cattle business, and they could all think that they were like cowboys. So because they were sitting in an office in Chicago or in Boston, and he brought them into the deal. They all owned a ranch together, and they all made tons of money when the ranch sold. So this was like a great thing that Fred did. Fred always had angles. But he was a guy who always had angles, but always did the right thing. So that was his reputation. This is a picture of Fred during this time as he's getting prosperous. It was taken in San Francisco. This is his wife, Sally, who did not travel with him that much, was really at home. We can follow her doings in the newspapers in Leavenworth because she became obsessed with euchre while Fred was away. Ran big euchre tournaments in her house, which was not a casino, but and the euchre tournaments were reported on in the paper, like in the sports section. And the Harveys were kind of the nouveau riche of Leavenworth, and the people who'd been rich there before had their questions about him, but as it got bigger and bigger, they sort of got involved. So the Harvey Company at this point literally is 4 cities in Kansas and 1 in Colorado, and then they come into New Mexico and everything changes. So my intern made this this PowerPoint thing and said, watch this, it's going to be really cool. So this is actually what the lines look like to the railroads. So the railroads don't deal with, they only look at, this is like one of the really stylized maps. So the Santa Fe Railroad came into, it worked, came into Las Vegas on July 4th of 1879 and quickly moved its way across the country. February 9th of 1880 in Laney, it bypassed Santa Fe, as we know, then on to, that's the branch line of Santa Fe. It went on to Albuquerque, to San Marcial, to Rincon, to Deming, to the Texas border, and then they came back and built the branch line from Las Vegas out to the Montezuma Hotel. And that was a good slide, huh? Now we'll move. There you go. And what we know is there was no restaurant in Las Vegas when the Fred Harvey Company came there, so they actually brought a train car, and they made it into a restaurant, and it sat on the trackside, and this is an earliest article from 1880 about that restaurant. They also took over what was the old Stone Hotel up on the Hot Springs, and the railroad decided to build a huge health resort next to it was called the Montezuma. Fred Harvey basically moved here for a long period of time. Ironically, his own health was really compromised by working on this hotel. It was so difficult. It opened in the spring of 1882 to huge national press. The press corps from all over the world came to this. It was so beautiful. It was so cool. Unfortunately, it was a terrible business. And in fact, we recently found this. Actually, Heather Paxton, one of our researchers here in the front row, she found this. This is the joke of research. We went through the Las Vegas Optic about 10 times we were writing the book. This article wasn't there in the thing when we looked for it, but it was there then when we found it recently. So this is actually the first hint that Fred Harvey actually wants out of the Montezuma after a year. So Fred Harvey actually a year later is no longer actually running the Montezuma. A lot of his employees are still there, but what they're realizing is the Fred Harvey Company wants to be a trackside hotel business, not that, and the Santa Fe takes the Montezuma over and ran the Montezuma for all the other years that it was run. Interestingly, this is around the same time that the Harvey girls start. Now, we don't have exact everything perfect about the Harvey girls, and if you guys want to start researching things, start looking at 1883 and try to figure out the exact things that went from Fred pulling out of the Montezuma to the Harvey girls starting later that year. But basically what happened was, in New Mexico, all waiters were African-American men. There were just no single women here who weren't prostitutes. But there was also great racism here because a lot of the cowboys had been Confederate soldiers. So the African-American male waiters were living in fear. And after another racial incident in Raton, it was decided that the Fred Harvey Company would start bringing in waitresses and having single women run at the counters rather than African-American men. This was not decided by Fred. And one of the things you need to know about Fred was that Fred was a great delegator, a great believer in his employees and their ideas. It was the idea of this guy, Tom Gable. We actually found this picture not that long ago, too. Tom Gable was interesting because he started the Harvey Girls. For those of you who know your Santa Fe history, Tom Gable also was the first game warden of the territory of New Mexico and helped build the fish hatchery up in Pecos. And so if you hunt or fish in New Mexico, the great-great-grandparents of the animals you're catching and killing were brought here by Tom Gable. Just an aside, I've been fishing all week. So. The Harvey Girls obviously became a huge phenomenon as the company took this policy and moved it all around the country. 100,000 women had the experience of being Harvey Girls from the 1880s through the 1940s. It was an opportunity for women to travel, to live independently. The deal was you came, they trained you in the Midwest, and they sent you to wherever they needed you to be. You got a 6-month contract, which you signed agreeing not to get married. And if you stayed single, or could conceal the fact that you weren't with child for 6 months, you then got a bonus of a trip anywhere on the Santa Fe, and then you could re-up if the Harvey Company liked you. And this was, you can't underestimate the importance of the Harvey Girls and the growth of American women, especially in the Midwest and the West. I mean, there were no other opportunities for women to work, to travel, and the Harvey Girls that you meet today, former Harvey Girls, are all great. You can only imagine, since they were products of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, what the people from the 80s, 90s, and teens were, how different they were from most women. So it's a really cool tradition. These are just a variety of pictures of Harvey Girls that we have found over the years. There are lots more to find, I will tell you. Some urban, some suburban, some out in the middle of nowhere. This is one of my favorite paintings of a Harvey Girl, which is going to be in the show. It was actually created, a lot of art was created during the Harvey Girls movie, and this is a painting that was created during the Harvey Girls movie. They also set off years of tchotchkes that you could buy having to do with Harveys. You can still buy these Harvey Girl figurines, but this is a really old one from the Skip Gentry collection, which will, no? It's from a different collection, but it will be part of the show here. This is one of the few pictures you ever see of a Harvey girl with a guy. Because the reason the Harvey Girls were dressed like nuns with bow ties is because they wanted to make sure that no one thought that anything, untoward was going on. So they were never photographed with men, even though, of course, how many of you have seen the movie The Harvey Girls? So at the beginning, there's like a 98-minute montage, which is basically like a bunch of guys in town waiting for single women on a train to come in. That's probably the only thing in that movie that's true. Because think of it, in any social setting, when single people come in, that's a big deal. And the Fred Harvey Company, one of their side businesses, was bringing new single women into towns large and small across the country. There were also, we don't talk about it that much, a lot of Harvey men. Of course, the Harveys trained generation after generation of restaurant managers, chef. It was America's culinary school before there was any kind of culinary schools in America. And while Fred Harvey's name was out there and everybody knew it, the day-to-day operations were run by this guy, David Benjamin, a Jewish immigrant from London, and he had been Fred Harvey's bank teller in Leavenworth, and he was made Harvey's accountant, and within a year he was running the day-to-day operations of the company. He was also a guy who always found himself in difficult situations and could always wiggle out. In 1899, he was on a business trip to Galveston, the day of the Galveston hurricane. Did fine. In 1906, he just happened to be in San Francisco the day of the Great San Francisco earthquake. And in the summer of 1914, before the Harveys opened their Kansas City Union Station, he and his family decided to take the Great Tour of Europe. Not a great time to take the Great Tour of Europe. They were stranded there, and the federal government actually had to send gold on ships to bring the American citizens that were stuck in Europe back. But David Benjamin was a guy who was completely unflappable and stood in day to day for Fred. They worked out of a little office actually in the Union Depot in Kansas City. But because the name went out there and a lot of people found out about it. So this is the earliest piece of Fred Harvey's Santa Fe china. If you find this in your stuff, Meredith wants it. But if you sell it, you could probably retire a lot of times. The Harvey market is very big. But more important and more interesting, I think, are the Harvey system lessons, which still seem incredibly modern today. So this is a list of Harvey fundamentals that was taken from a dining car chef's materials. I made a PowerPoint on it so you can read it. But this is really interesting. These go back to the 1880s, and think about this. So, I mean, some of them are kind of obvious, but look at the end. Real services without discrimination. This is a company that was working in areas that still had Jim Crow laws, which they violated because they did not have separate seating. Preserve or create, never destroy. I mean, a lot of companies right now are starting to get an environmental message. Fred Harvey was talking about it more than 100 years ago. Tact is an asset and honesty is still a virtue. And they created a Harvey way to do everything so they could train all their staff, not to be robots, but to very creatively make sure they did excellent service. So every morning, Fred found out by telegram how many eggs, how many cigars. Apparently cigars were more important than food during the 1880s. So cigars actually mattered more. Had been consumed at each of his restaurants. They had a rule for everything, including the famous Harvey Girl cup code, which when you ordered a drink, they turned your cup in a different direction depending on what you ordered, so the pourer could come in and do this and save time. Because they had 30 minutes to serve you a complete meal before the trains had to leave. They standardized the recipes, but unlike a chain today, you didn't get the same thing at every Harvey restaurant. If you were on a long trip, you would get different meals at the next place because they knew you were going to be on a long ride. And the chefs could be entrepreneurial. They would buy things and send them out through the system. In train cars, they had their own locks and keys for them. And by 1884, because of 12 restaurants, Fred was personally making the equivalent of $1.1 million in pure profit in cash a year. There were no taxes then. And the company was making a lot of money, even though it was a tiny company, and basically run by their smarts, and it ended in New Mexico. And then in the late 1880s, the railroad overnight expanded from Albuquerque all the way to California. Basically, the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad was taken over by the Santa Fe, and Fred Harvey had to take over all the eating houses in Arizona and in California, which went all the way to San Francisco overnight, which was very, very difficult. During this time, he asked his son to quit college and come into the family business. This is Ford Harvey, who people don't know is a hero of this story, but in fact, Ford Harvey was Fred Harvey longer than Fred Harvey was. I will explain. Good-looking young man, Fred's oldest. This is him with his wife. And part of the reason that Ford had to come into the business was that Fred wanted to teach him the business, and part of it was that Fred was ill. And you can tell by this portrait that he was not a well man. Fred had what we would today diagnose as a combination of depression and probably either ulcerative colitis, some kind of stomach problem. And he was diagnosed as having Americanitis. This was actually a diagnosis at the time, sort of pre-psychiatric diagnosis. It was a disease of the rich. It was caused by the pressures of success of America. So it only happened to successful people, and the only treatment for it was to leave America. So starting in 1884, as his empire was growing, he turned over the keys to David Benjamin and to his son, and was in England for more than half of the year, basically waiting to feel better. And they would send him telegrams, he would make major decisions, but he was less and less involved day to day, and more answering questions from England. And then, in the late 1880s, the Santa Fe Railroad got into financial trouble, and they fired the guy who loved Fred, who had allowed all this stuff to happen. And the Santa Fe Railroad and the Fred Harvey Company actually went to legal war for like 4 years. Now, no one told this story when the Santa Fe was telling the story, because it's not so romantic. But it was not pretty. It was a big legal situation. Fred Harvey won in part because he had given away so many free passes to politicians and judges over the years. And those free passes were like gold back then. That miraculously, the Santa Fe Railroad, which had billions of dollars, I mean, it was the biggest railroad in the world at that time, and all lawyers they had, was beaten out by its little concessionaire. and they could hold the line, but it was a very difficult time. And the only reason the Fred Harvey Company was saved was that the Santa Fe Railroad went bankrupt in 1893, and the receivers could not afford to fire Fred Harvey, because if they would have to take over the food themselves. So Fred Harvey Company was saved, and it was restarted as America was restarted in the middle 1890s after the Depression. So Ford took over the business. They made a new deal with the Santa Fe. The Santa Fe finally added dining cars in the West, which the Fred Harvey Company took over. They added retail, and the Fred Harvey set up a side business to start running Union stations. And Fred Harvey started becoming a brand. So even though Ford was running the company, what you saw was Fred Harvey's name. His signature was turned into a logo. They started signing everything that came out of the office Fred Harvey as if Fred Harvey had signed it. And they really created this idea of American branding, which was very new at that time. So they went into dining cars, they went into Union stations. At this time, Ford's sister, Minnie, and her husband, John Huckle, who had been in the retail business and in the publishing business in New York, came back to Kansas City to be involved in the family business. And John Huckle ran all the retail. So these are some of the stores that were in St. Louis Union Station in the 1890s. They had amazing 24-hour-a-day bookstores that delivered not only in the city, but if you were traveling and you ordered a book, it could be in the hotel you were going to in the next city. And there were articles in Publishers Weekly during this time that if there's going to be chain bookstores in the world, it would be great if they were all like Fred Harvey stores. That's the truth. So Fred didn't get to see a lot of this. He was increasingly ill, increasingly in England. This is the last picture that was ever taken of him. And he died in 1901 of complications of colon cancer. He left this amazing will, which basically said that his estate could not be probated for 10 years. And basically no one could say he was dead for 10 years. Because they wanted to make sure that the Fred Harvey brand continued. So his kids were not happy because they didn't get a penny for 10 years. But the company maintained exactly the way it was without a beat. And during that time, a lot of things happened that really affected New Mexico. So the Alvarado Hotel was opened. This is actually a great picture of the Alvarado, which shows how close this very serene garden was to the trains. They're very mindful of how close they needed to be to the trains, but they really wanted to have amazing spaces. And around this time in 1901, the Santa Fe finished a railroad to the Grand Canyon, which it had no idea what it would do. The Grand Canyon had been a mine, and some of the miners had started taking people on burro rides because the mining was so bad. And they had this idea there would be tourism, so the Santa Fe decided to get involved. The turning point is a great thing for New Mexico and for northern Southwest tourism, because basically in 1901, right after this train was finished, the top brass of the Santa Fe Railroad, including Fort Harvey, took a journey through what we now consider to be the most basic places you would go. Acoma, Chaco Canyon, all those places that at that time, up to the Four Corners, places that no one really went at that time. And they went and they roughed it. You can see they're all wearing their roughening outfits. They roughed it, although they had like hundreds of people there to like make tents for them and beds for them. They had 100 Navajo Indians ahead of them everywhere they went. And somebody should make a movie about this trip, actually. It's actually fairly well documented. And so they discovered what the northern New Mexico, what northern Arizona could be if people actually stopped and looked at it. And they spent several days there with Charles Loomis, who was a great popularizer of the Southwest. This is one of their campsites. And they ended up at the lip of the Grand Canyon arguing about where El Tovar should go. That's Fort Harvey on the left, that's Charles Loomis on the right. The reason that El Tovar is such a weird shape is because the company wanted to build it out over the edge, and Charles Loomis thought that was terrible, and he got them to agree not to do it, but he was afraid they wouldn't listen. So he went to his friend Teddy Roosevelt, who he'd gone to college with, and told him that the Santa Fe was going to build this hotel and ruin the Grand Canyon. And the president did convince him not to do it, and in fact, Teddy Roosevelt's famous environmental speech at the tip of the Grand Canyon, if you read the whole speech, the beginning of it is about El Tovar. The beginning of it is about, when he's talking about we can't ruin anything that's natural in this country, all this kind of stuff. The first line of it is, I congratulate the Santa Fe Railroad for finally deciding not to build their hotel off the end of it. And then no one writes that part. They only write the part that's more global. So at this time, Ford comes back from his trip. He has that southwestern look in his eyes that you guys probably all had before you moved here, right? The first time you came out, it's like, wow, can I live here? Can I never go back? Can I buy turquoise for everything? So he came back to Kansas City, and his sister, who actually had been collecting here already and was really into this already, saw this as a great opportunity, and they decided they would go on the side into the Native American art business. They actually just wanted to open a little museum in Albuquerque in a little space that was between the train station and the hotel. They brought on a guy called Herman Schweitzer, who was their manager at Gallup, who knew a lot about Native American art. He had been going up into the Navajo reservation and getting people to make him more tourist-friendly art. At the same time, he was curating and buying things that no one could have. So the interesting aspect of the Harvey Company is that it both saved most of the Native American art that existed and also popularized more commercial versions of Native American art at the same time. So Schweitzer ran this operation, and it was Schweitzer who hired Mary Coulter. So Mary Coulter was an industrial designer. She lived in Minneapolis. They found out about her because of a friend of hers who worked for Fred Harvey on one of the ships in San Francisco, because they had a restaurant on the ships between Oakland and San Francisco Bay. They told her about Mary Coulter. They brought Mary Coulter in to design what became called the Indian Building. Now, the Indian Building was supposed to be a museum. It was just supposed to be a thing for them to show off how great Native American art was and to get people to take Native American art more seriously. What they didn't count on is that, one, Mary Coulter would do this amazing design, and that all these Native American things that normally would be seen in a pretty spare environment, when brought all together in a lush environment, seemed like something that people really wanted. She did it mostly for display originally, but in fact, people saw it and said, I want my house to look like that. And now all your houses do look like that. So they thought they were having one museum, and in fact, people kept coming in and saying, I want to buy that. I want to buy this whole room. I want this in my house. So suddenly the Fred Harvey Company had to start collecting at an unbelievable level. And they came, every time somebody died who had a lot of stuff in Santa Fe or anywhere in New Mexico, the Harvey Company bought the estate because their business in Native American art grew and grew and grew. And the Indian Building became this incredibly popular place. It also just turned out that, you know, when movies began in California, the train went through Albuquerque. So in fact, the first people who learned about the first cowboy movies were shot at the Alvarado because these directors were coming back from California and they saw these Native Americans by the place. So in 1911, Max Sennett, who was mostly did comedies, made this short, a silent movie called The Tourists, the story of which was that a bunch of tourists missed their train in Albuquerque. And so the women were kidnapped by mean Native Americans. And then the Indian suffragettes, which were the Indian women, went on the warpath, withheld certain things from their husbands until the white women were turned back. And then everybody lived happily ever after and waited for the back of the train. So this is, you know, early days of film, but this was filmed at the Alvarado, and lots of other movies were filmed at and around the Alvarado. And most people in Hollywood found out about cowboys, whatever they knew, and Indians, whatever they knew, which was often little, from this. Mary Coulter was brought back. Her thing at the Indian Building was a freelance gig. She was brought back in 1905 to build across from El Tovar, which they were building at the Grand Canyon. They created Hopi House. Hopi House was an Indian building that never existed, that looked exactly like a real Indian building. It was also designed so that tourists could go in and out of it, and the top artists in the Southwest were hired to live in it and make art there. It was like a big World's Fair exhibit, which is a lot of what the Fred Harvey Company was embracing. And so during this time, this is how big the Harvey Company was getting. I mean, it was growing. They were serving an incredible number of meals. Ford was running it kind of privately because he really couldn't come out. But 10 years after his dad died, they could finally probate the will. Ford could start being a more public person, and he became, you know, sort of a bigger hero. At least in Kansas City, people realized that he was involved in all this. He had his own company, Maxims. One of the favorites in the Fred Harvey Company was always please the cranks. Because didn't do anything to please people who liked you. Never take yourself too damn seriously, which I have to say Fred Harvey never did. And he's a guy who I think we could learn a lot more about. He's a great character who never gets much attention. He was involved in taking over the creation of Kansas City Union Station. And one of the biggest things, which really also put Santa Fe on the map, Ford and Mary Coulter and Herman Schweitzer and the leading people in Santa Fe were involved in the creation of the different exhibits at the World's Fairs in California in 1915. We're coming up on the 100th anniversary of this. I hope every museum in the country is going to do something cool about this, because it really is a great turning point in American travel and in our understanding of America. But The leading people at the Fred Harvey Company and people in Santa Fe created a pueblo, which many of the Pueblo Indians from around here went and lived on for a year, including Maria Martinez, who became famous later for black on black pottery. She was one of the Native Americans hired by the Fred Harvey Company to live in this pueblo, to be a living World's Fair exhibit for a year. And this is also when more people came to the Southwest than ever before, because they came to the fairs, they came to the Grand Canyon, they came to Santa Fe, and all of a sudden the possibilities of tourism became clear. This is also when the National Park Service began, and the Harveys were very, very involved in the creation of the National Park Service. When the war ended, this all exploded in travel. Fred Harvey assumed that he'd be passing on this business eventually to his kids. So his older daughter, Kitty Harvey, was not in the business, but she was a big collector, very business savvy, also openly gay, one of the first openly gay women in Midwestern and Western society. This is a picture of her playing baseball at Indian Gardens at Grand Canyon. And her kid brother, Freddie, who was a World War I pilot, very dashing, very irresponsible, but smart, and these were to be the future of the company. And they knew the railroads were not going to last, because the railroads had been federalized during the First World War, and everybody in the railroad business knew it was never going to be the same. So they started looking into how they would be able to cater to people in cars, because Route 66 ran along the railroad, and also got involved in the airline business. This is when the tourism business began, right here in Santa Fe. And this is the original La Fonda before they expanded it. And they created Indian Detours. And the idea of Indian Detours is that you would go by car across northern New Mexico. You would go to wherever you wanted to go. It was a la carte. But you could visit all the pueblos. You could see all the snake dances you wanted. You could, and it was very, very popular, nationally advertised. This is a great image that's being used in the show. Really beautiful image of a Harvey car. By this time, the company had cars. And some of the dudes and the Indian Details couriers who would take people around and let them see northern New Mexico. These are the Indian Detours couriers posing right around the corner from here. And it was an amazing business. This is Freddie Harvey putting in the first spade for the expansion of La Fonda. When this became so popular, they realized they needed to double the size of La Fonda, which they did in the late 1920s. This is also when Conrad Algier, the famous chef from La Fonda, came here and began serving he was German, so he was serving sort of German fusion, New Mexican, international cuisine. The Harvey cuisine was interesting because it was very much American, but at the same time they did international cuisine. So you go to a Harvey restaurant, you get classic French, classic Italian, and classic and American local cuisine. It was actually a fascinating combination of those things. And La Fonda, of course, became very, very popular. The company also went into the airline business. Transcontinental Air Transport was the first cross-country air service. At this time, planes didn't have lights, airports didn't have lights, you could only fly during the day, not very far. So the way you used planes was, you got on a train in New York, because no one would fly over the Allegheny Mountains, too dangerous. You take a train to Columbus, Ohio, you get in one of these planes and fly to Winslow, Arizona, to Waynoka, Oklahoma, which is a Fred Harvey outpost. You'd have a Fred Harvey dinner. Then you would take the overnight train to Clovis, New Mexico. You'd have a Fred Harvey breakfast. Then you would fly from Clovis to Winslow, Arizona, and have dinner, and then take the train to Los Angeles. And by doing that, you could save a whole day crossing the country. Freddie Harvey was a partner in this with Henry Ford, with Charles Lindbergh, with all the leading lights of the day. And he was in charge, obviously, of the food. So there are some challenges serving food on these planes in the 1920s. First of all, they had windows that opened. So that's a problem. They were not pressurized, so occasionally you would bleed from your ears. That's that. And Freddie Harvey was very open with the press that his biggest challenge was to serve food that people would not throw up. But somehow they did their best. And so the company in 1928 was poised to be transportation friendly to the end of time. It was not going to be taking advantage of the fact that the railroads were on their way out. And then Fred Harvey died in 1928 of the flu. He did not leave the kind of plans for the future of the company that his father had. And so there became a family fight. As you know, family businesses are usually taken down by fights between family members, not necessarily because of business, although it doesn't help that the family fight is during the biggest depression in the 20th century, which is what the Harveys confronted. So Freddie and his sister Kitty inherited all the stock of the company, but Ford's younger brother Byron in Chicago thought that it was his time to run the family business. And so the two of them were at war during this time period. Minnie Harvey, who we heard about before, who was instrumental in the Native American art business, she tried to get in the middle of all this. And this picture, which I found in the family album in Santa Fe, gives you an idea about how well people were getting along. So it was a little bit of a tense time between the Kansas City Harveys and the Chicago Harveys. But interestingly, even though there was a depression on, some of the things we most love about the Fred Harvey Company still went forward. La Posada was built during this time. The company, the Santa Fe Railroad, went ahead to build it even though the depression had started. The Desert Watchtower, which I think arguably is the coolest thing that Mary Coulter ever designed, was built at the Grand Canyon during this time. Then Breno China was developed at this time by Mary Coulter for the Super Chief. Bright Angel Lodge was built during this time. So a lot of cool things were built, even though the times were tough. And then Freddie Harvey crashed his plane in the Allegheny Mountains after he'd been told not to fly over them because the weather was bad. He and his wife, clutching their little dog, died. And the company was inherited by his sister, who everybody thought should run it, but she was one of the smartest people in financial Kansas City had ever seen. But her uncle told her that a woman couldn't run Fred Harvey. The irony of a company that was so much about women working that she was told that she couldn't run it was very painful, but they forced her to sell out. She moved to California with her girlfriend, who also lived out there, who was a Perkins. So two great railroad families, and they lived together out there for decades to come, and were big philanthropists. And the company was moved to Chicago and taken over by Byron Harveys, and all the Harveys we know today are descendants of Byron Harvey. Because none of the other Harveys had children, and Kitty Harvey didn't have any kids, and Freddie Harvey and his wife and little dog didn't make it. So the Byron Harveys ran the company from Chicago. They ran the company fine. They did not have the same kind of ambition that Fred and Ford had. And the company by this time was really driven by the Grand Canyon. They did one more big thing, which was LA Union Station. For those of you who've been watching the news, LA Union Station, this amazing room that Mary Coulter designed as a restaurant, is now going to be a restaurant again. The lease was just signed a couple weeks ago, so you'll be able to go to a really cool gastro pub there. And in Santa Fe, obviously, one of the big parts of this whole time period of the war coming and Fred Harvey being so important is that Robert Oppenheimer and all the people from Los Alamos, basically they used La Fonda as their watering hole when experiments went bad or good. So if you talk to people who worked there at the time, they of course all remember them all coming back the day that the bomb worked. They remember less of the stories of all the failures they had, but it is in itself an amazing history. And it's of course during this time that the Harvey Girls movie was made. And the Harvey Girls movie was huge. I mean, this is a picture of Elizabeth Taylor holding a box of Harvey Girl chocolates. And I mean, there was such press for this movie. It was like the way we see a movie today, but it wasn't that common at that time. But as I said, the company got smaller after the Santa Fe Railroad didn't want to keep the places open, and it constricted to the places that Fred Harvey could run, mostly in northern New Mexico and in northern Arizona. The company bought El Tovar in the 1950s. For those of you who have been watching the fight about the concession at the Grand Canyon, the reason they're fighting about the concessions at the Grand Canyon South Rim is because the federal government owns the land, but the Fred Harvey Company owns the buildings. And the company that bought Fred Harvey still owns the buildings. And the buildings are now worth $200 million. So no one else can get the contract unless they pay the $200 million, and that's why they're all fighting. The Harvey Company continued to run La Fonda in Santa Fe until the Ballons bought it in the 1960s. Kitty Harvey lived until the mid-60s. She had most of the family stuff, and when she died, she donated a lot of it to all kinds of different places. For those of you who noticed, the federal government put out a stamp the other day with a Thomas Moran painting of the Grand Canyon. I don't know if you saw it. That painting is signed, if you look really close, it says, "To my good friend Fred Harvey." That was a painting that Moran did himself for the Harveys, was in the Harvey family collection, was donated to Nelson Atkins, and is now on a postage stamp. So Kitty Harvey owned a lot of other stuff. We don't even know where all of it is. And the company that became Xanterra bought the Fred Harvey Company in the 70s. Now this begins the time when things didn't go so well for the Harvey legacy, which is why we're also happy that we're even talking about this today. So for those of you who live in northern New Mexico, you know the Alvarado, after a long preservation fight, was destroyed. And a lot of other places were endangered, obviously the Castaneda. The Harvey art collection, luckily, was kept together by the family. It was separated from the sale, and it was donated to the Heard Museum in Phoenix. And the Heard Museum began the curation of some of the Harvey things. They had several very important shows, one in the 80s, one in the mid-90s, that became the beginnings of what I think of as sort of the new Fred revivalism. the Fredisons, as we call it. But a lot of that also started happening in New Mexico. In Belen, New Mexico, some of you know Maureen McMillan. She was one of the first to have an idea for how the local Fred Harvey restaurant could be turned into a little museum. A couple from California, Alan Affeld and Tina Mione, bought La Posada in Winslow and began bringing it back to life, a model that we now believe they will bring to Las Vegas because they bought the Castaneda and the Plaza Hotel. Castaneda sat there vacant for a really long time. People were really scared about it. I remember being here 4 years ago thinking, you know, if I ever got up here and they were talking about the Castaneda being reopened, it would be a miracle. And Jenny Kimball just bought La Fonda from the Ballin family. Just so you know, the Ballins were not so into the Fred Harvey thing. Because honestly, when they bought the hotel, the Fred Harvey thing was not a popular thing anymore in the 60s and 70s. So while they had great respect for the city and La Fonda was a cornerstone of the city, they were not that interested in making sure the Fred stuff was real prominent. When Jenny took over the board of managers a number of years ago, she started bringing more of it back and started seeing more Fred stuff in there. I think you'll see even more Fred stuff there. We consider Jenny a Fred hit. And before I finish, what I would like to put forward, because a number of people have asked about this, is that people would ask, well, what can we do with all this new interest in Fred Harvey? I mean, I think it's an incredible opportunity for the state. It's an incredible opportunity for schools. It's an incredible opportunity for Las Vegas, even for Albuquerque that has run away from its past. And I just want to suggest some things that we can think about in terms of what we do next with this interest. It's important to reclaim the Fred Harvey, Harvey Girl, and Santa Fe Railroad stories of Las Vegas, Albuquerque, and Santa Fe. In reality, we know less about them than you think. It's just the stories you've already told are really good stories. But there are long periods of time where we don't know too many stories. It's important to explore the earliest Harvey Girls. This is a completely New Mexican story. The Harvey Girls were invented in New Mexico to deal with New Mexico. Most of the things you hear about Harvey Girls are from 20th century people who are still alive. So there's a lot we do not know about the first 10 or 20 years of Harvey Girls. The life of the Indian building, which is incredibly interesting, incredibly controversial in some areas of Native American art, has not been well documented, but it is a thing that existed in New Mexico, mattered to the whole world. Every museum that has Native American art that was born in the 20th century, almost every piece of it originally sat at the Indian building in Albuquerque. The Fred Harvey Company was the center of all collecting of Native American art. We actually know very little about Mary Coulter, even though we talk about her a lot. We know very little about her personally, we know very little about her stuff, and while people are always told that it's finite and it's all gone, we find new stuff all the time. It's in people's closets, people took it, people have it, they don't know what to do with it. Bring it to us. We don't bring it to Meredith, bring it to the museum. These things are, when they redid the Montezuma Hotel in Las Vegas, they found that people had like huge parts of it. I mean, somebody had the fireplace in the main lobby in their garage. Because it had been taken when the Montezuma was useless. And when they put the word out that they wanted everything back, they needed everything back. Well, here's the word. The Castaneda is going to be reopened in the next year and a half. So any stuff that you have from there, let's get it back together. And the people who are trying to put together the Wheels Museum in Albuquerque are very much trying to maintain the Albuquerque part of the story, and they have plenty of storage space when they finally get open. So the Albuquerque stuff is available. Let's look at Harvey cuisine. Very little is known about it. And in fact, some of the great Harvey chefs were New Mexico chefs, not only Conrad Algier, Dan Taché, who was the chef at Castaneda. There's much to be known. Explore the role of the Harveys and La Fonda in the cultural and scientific life of Santa Fe. Explore how U.S. history, travel, and the legacy of the Indian Detours can be used to rebrand and reinvigorate New Mexico tourism. And let's rebirth Las Vegas the way that Winslow, Arizona was reborn, and use the Belen Harvey House as a model for the smaller Fred Harvey cities across the state. I'm going to end, as I always do, with my favorite Fred Harvey picture. This is from 1930, Albert Einstein at the Grand Canyon. When Albert Einstein came to America on his famous tour of the country, when he gave his famous lectures at Caltech, he mentioned that every little kid in the world, even little German kids, want to play cowboys and Indians when they're little. So somebody had the bright idea to bring him to the Grand Canyon, which is what celebrities did at that time, and still do. So when a celebrity came to the Grand Canyon, they were named an honorary chief. So Albert Einstein got there, he got off the train, he saw all these Native Americans who he thought were just there. He didn't realize they worked for the Fred Harvey Company and their job was to be Native Americans there. He just thought that, a flock of them had come by, he thought that was and so the Native Americans who worked for Fred Harvey, they went to Herman Schweitzer, who we met before up there in the corner, and they said, well, who is this guy? They said, well, he invented the theory of relativity. And they said, okay, we will name him the Great Relative. And this picture of Albert Einstein being named the Great Relative was on the front page of every newspaper the next day. That's what a big deal going to the Grand Canyon was at that time, such an unusual thing. I'm going to stop here and take questions. If anybody ever needs to find me or interested in this, you can find me on my Facebook page, my Facebook author page. We also maintain a Harvey Girls cookbook page where we've been posting old Fred Harvey recipes, which you are welcome to try. I wouldn't use as much lard as they did, but that's up to you. And if you haven't read Appetite for America yet, I encourage you to do so. We will be signing books here later, and I will tell you that two things you should keep in mind. One, the December 7th opening of Setting the Standard, which Meredith has been working with incredibly hard with collectors and family members all over the country. It's going to be amazing. For those of you who have not been to Las Vegas yet and are interested in that, November 8th and 9th, we'll be doing events in Las Vegas. It's a wonderful series of events. You can find out about it through the Main Street Las Vegas site or through my site. You come Saturday, we're doing a cocktail party, a benefit cocktail party for Main Street Las Vegas at the Castaneda. There'll be a tour of the Castaneda. I'll give a talk, and then there'll be a Fred Harvey dinner at the Plaza Hotel, where I'll be speaking, Meredith will be speaking, representatives from Alan's group will be speaking, and I think we're going to make Steve Wimmer from La Fonda speak, although he's really resisting at this point. There's not that many tickets left to that. If you want to do it, I would encourage you to go online and buy them right away. So I'm going to stop now. Does anybody have any questions? Come on, so are we miking the questions or am I just repeating them?
You repeat them.
Okay, yes, go ahead, ma'am. Waynoka, Oklahoma. It's in the Panhandle. All the Fred Harvey stuff is in the western part of Oklahoma. It's actually much closer to Texas than to Oklahoma City. I can tell you because I drove there. Not only is there a building, but there's actually one of the best Fred Harvey museums in the country is in Waynoka. You know how Oklahoma supports the arts? They gave him this wonderful grant to recreate and Oklahoma was pretty important in the 20th century part of the Santa Fe Railroad story. And it's a great place. Yes?
Super lecture, thank you. And there are some Harvey girls still living. And I wonder if there are any in the audience.
Are there any Harvey girls in the audience? Oh, I thought since you asked, you would know. There is a new documentary called The Harvey Girls Opportunity Bound, which was on PBS in New Mexico and in Arizona. You can order copies of it. We'll be showing it here during the opening of the show, nonstop in this auditorium while people are touring the show. But there's actually a lot of Harvey girls still alive. All of them, obviously, because of time, served from the 40s forward. They have great stories, and we've had events with them here before, and I'm sure we'll again. Yes? Anybody else? Yes?
I understand that they dammed up the river just close to Montezuma in Las Vegas for ice for the Harvey House in Las Vegas.
The question was whether they dammed up the river for ice for the Harvey House, for the Montezuma. I think that's actually true. I think it actually was not that uncommon. I mean, I think that's how you got ice in the winter. You dammed up rivers, then you broke it up. The Montezuma was unbelievably lush. It had this incredible, it had a pool room, it had a casino, it had this incredible wine cellar, which when it burned down in 1884, they said that the firemen spent most of their time looting the wine cellar rather than trying to keep the building from burning down. But the Montezuma was an amazing, excessive place. The only thing I will say is that I've sort of put a damper on this by explaining that Fred Harvey wasn't involved with it for that long, which isn't good for the docents. But they've actually taken it okay. Yes?
Thank you.
Fred Harvey's original house in Leavenworth on Olive Street has been being restored longer than most of us have been alive. I have no belief that it will be done anytime soon, but if you're interested in going to Leavenworth where Fred Harvey grew up, the Carroll Mansion, the Historical Society of Leavenworth, actually has an exceptional Fred Harvey collection. Are you borrowing from their collection? Oh, it's long term. But they have a lot of original Fred Harvey letters. They have a lot of the china from Fred Harvey's house. They have these Edison discs of Fred Harvey's voice, which we've yet to be able to get a sound off of, but when Fred was sick and these Edison disc technology began, he and Ford sent recordings back and forth across the ocean because Fred wasn't sure that his family would ever see him again. And we've been spending years trying to get sound off these discs. Maybe someday. Any other questions? Yes?
How many Harvey houses along the train route, the original ones, are still around?
If you look in the appendix of my book, we actually have a list of every place where the building is still there. It depends on which state. I mean, there were a lot of the buildings. So some of the buildings in Kansas are still there. Most of the buildings in New Mexico are still there, but some of them, I mean, the one in Clovis, no one's walked into in years. The one in Lamy, sadly, is not around. Obviously, the Alvarado is not around. A number of the buildings in Arizona are there. I would say more buildings have been saved in New Mexico, Arizona, and California, and a handful in Texas. And a lot of cities save them and don't make them into restaurants or hotels. They make them into civic buildings to save them. But there are a number of them. You can tour them. We call it the Tour de Fred. The easiest Tour de Fred for people here is basically start in Las Vegas and go all the way to Grand Canyon. If you do that, you can see a great number of Fred Harvey properties, including the inn at the Petrified Forest, which is still very cool. But there are a number of them, and people have been trying to help. It's a very local thing. So local people have to get together to save the thing. You're lucky you live in Santa Fe that has always had, for most of everybody's lifetime, La Fonda. But there was a time when La Fonda was the only active Fred Harvey place left, except for the restaurants in the Grand Canyon. Now there's more, and there's the opportunity for more. Any other questions?
Can you put your website up again?
Yeah. No one's ever asked me that before. I always feel bad to leave it up there rather than a picture. But yeah, that's my personal website. This is my author webpage, and this is the Harvey Girls webpage where we post Harvey Girl recipes every day. In the back, yes?
Stephen, I teach cooking classes, and I've actually done a couple of classes out of your cookbook.
Okay.
And in the cookbook, their tortillas they made were made from cream of wheat. And they're not good. But I wonder, and we've made them.
Are you talking about, I haven't published a cookbook, so you didn't make them from my
The
cookbook.
Fred Harvey cookbook?
Yes.
No, there's one called the Harvey House Cookbook.
Oh, that's not related to you? I'm sorry. Okay.
No, a couple Trainiacs made that.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure they'd ever cooked before they made it.
Yeah.
They're really nice guys. We're trying to develop a real cookbook. A lot of those recipes were not great. I will say in their defense, what's interesting about the Harvey Company is that as they tried to bring different cuisines to America, they weren't always at the beginning trying to make sure they were completely authentic. They were trying to make sure that Americans would like them. Okay, so like the LA Union Station guacamole recipe has cream cheese in it, which you wouldn't do. But there actually are varieties of versions of all these, and in the different places, some places did very authentic things, some places didn't. But we have over 2,000 Harvey recipes now that we've found through our research, including every dish that was served at El Tovar in 1930 and the recipes for them, which we're hoping will form the basis of this cookbook, which we've been very slowly doing over the years because we're not good cooks either. But we do post them. If you try the recipes, please email us and let us know how they go. And I've heard about your cooking classes, and I've seen notice of cooking classes in other cities. If I ran a cooking school, I would at least do 1 week of Fred Harvey recipes. You can read the book. There's 50 recipes in my book. There's plenty of things to do. It's the Fred Harvey story, among everything else, it's a great teaching tool. And the Harveys knew this themselves. Part of the Harveys' job was to explain the history of the West to Americans. That's what history tourism was. The Harvey Company kind of invented history tourism. So they thought of the materials they created as a way of teaching about a lot of things, about service, about cuisine, about Native American history. If you looked at how Native American history was taught in America before the materials the Fred Harvey Company created for their guides, the story, it was a white man's story of America before the Fred Harvey Company came out here and created the materials that were used at the Grand Canyon, used in Santa Fe, and telling a history of America that went back to the actual beginning of America. So it's actually a fascinating cultural phenomenon in a lot of different ways. But then I'm biased. Yes?
Could you introduce Meredith and how we can contact her?
To Meredith, stand up. This is Meredith Davidson, who is the curator of 19th and 20th century here at the museum, and we believe that She was brought in primarily to deal with Fred Harvey, but obviously there's many other things to do. But we lobbied for her to be brought in because we wanted somebody who was going to be involved in this, because there's a ton of Harvey stuff here now, and we're hoping even much more. There's a lot of private collectors, either themselves or their families, trying to decide what to do with their materials. A lot of the Fred Harvey stuff left the company's hands or are in private hands. So what's cool about it is that you can retell parts of the story as soon as you find these things. Literally, like 6 months ago, somebody donated to the Heard Museum Mary Coulter's fabric book for La Posada. Okay? No one even knew it existed. Okay? It's hundreds of pages of fabric swatches that she did for every surface at La Posada. The people at La Posada were not happy when they found out that somebody knew this still existed, but now you can see it. There's actually a couple slides of it online right now. But you'd be amazed what we don't have, but could still easily be in private hands. Mary Coulter lived here. I have no doubt there are people in Santa Fe who own things that were in Mary Coulter's house that would be of value to us in recreating her life. Oh, yes. Before we take any more questions, let Meredith talk a little bit about the upcoming show. I would love that. Go ahead.
First of all, can we give Stephen another hand? Thank you all for coming out. I mean, this is a packed house. I mean, it always is with Stephen, but it's really a special thing to have everyone come out. So on December 7th, just a little bit about the show that's coming up. On the mezzanine level now, where you have some Fred Harvey content, we're kind of fleshing that out. It's going to be a much bigger story. All day from 10 to 5 on the hour, we're going to be showing Katrina Parks' documentary on Harvey Girls, so you can stop by every hour and watch it. At 2 p.m., Stephen, myself, and Katrina Parks will be in here having a kind of informal conversation about our process of discovering Fred Harvey and working with Fred Harvey history. And, one of the things that Stephen and I talk about all the time is that the Fred Harvey story will take you down any rabbit hole you can imagine, and that it's kind of a never-ending topic. And so if you do have aspects of the story, if you do have things in your house, I mean, I really do encourage you to reach out to us because I think it's really going to grow from here. So you can reach me on our website. There's contact information, and you're welcome to email me with questions. I'm much better with email than phone, so try me on email. And Stephen will be back again and again, hopefully. And he's been completely integral in the content for the exhibit. And so I think you'll be, I think you'll have a great time. So I hope you come out for that opening.
I know people are hungry, but I'm happy to take a few more questions. Yes, ma'am.
Is there any connection with this exhibit that
the question was whether there's any connection between this exhibit here and the Mills and Rogers. Only that the Mills and Rogers has some things that come from people from Harvey family members in Santa Fe. The Mills and Rogers show is a relatively small show, and the number of things in it that the strongest things in it, I think, are the things that the Mills and Rogers are the strongest on. They have Maria Martinez's work, they have Nampeo's work. So I think the things that are really strong is that you never saw before are things like that. I haven't been to the show, but I talked to the director of it when he was planning it, and I heard it's really, Mills and Rogers is a great little museum. But keep in mind, that's a